We're going to get started. So thank you, everyone, for coming to tonight's presentation, which is the highlight of the college's year-long community read. Wells College is located in an area rich in history, entrenched in social movements and activism that have influenced our campus community throughout our more than 150-year history. We chose The Agitators by Dorothy Wickenden to help bring a greater appreciation for this beautiful and idyllic place that we find ourselves living, working, and learning in. We are therefore very excited to have the author here with us tonight. In addition to The Agitators, she is also the author of New York Times bestseller, Nothing Daunted, The Unexpected Education of Two Society Girls in the West. She is a staff writer at The New Yorker, where she also served as executive editor for 26 years. Please join me in giving an enthusiastic welcome to Dorothy Wickenden.
It's a little bright. Thank you, Tiffany, and thanks to Susan Hanking and everybody else who played a hand in organizing this. It's so great to be back in Aurora and in this part of the world, which I love very much. I went to William Smith College, as some of you know, and that doubtless is where some of the germs for this book began. So my grandmother, as some of you know, grew up about 15 miles north of here in Auburn. Her father was a button manufacturer there. It was a big industrial city at the time. She and her best friend, Rosamond Underwood, were born in 1888, and I'd never forgotten her telling me that one day when they were little girls standing on South Street, they saw an elderly woman go by, and it was Harriet Tubman. And just that, I have never gotten that out of my mind, so we will then continue and you'll see how I got onto this story. So my grandmother was a wonderful raconteur, and most of her stories were actually true, like that one. So my first book, Nothing Daunted, was based on the really entertaining letters she and Roz had written after when they were out in the wilds of Colorado, where they taught school after they finished their education at Smith College, years after they finished, and they were unmarried. And they went out there and they taught school to the children of homesteaders on a remote mountaintop. And they both, I ended up, my mother saved my grandmother's letters, and 2 years later, after I discovered those, I found Rosamond's letters, and they just formed the basis of that entire book. And hence my discovery of what a wonderful resource letters can be if you have a good letter writer. I had never been to Auburn at that time, and while researching Nothing Daunted, I decided I better go and look around. Dorothy had also said that her grandparents had lived next door to William H. Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State. And they had, as I found out. And when I was there, I took a tour of the Seward House Museum and found myself fascinated by what the young guide had to say, yes, about Seward, but really about his wife, Frances. And I learned that as a young woman in the 1850s, a decade before the Civil War, she had worked tirelessly with two friends to overturn slavery and advocate equal rights for women. Those friends, as many of you know, were a woman named Martha Coffin Wright, who lived around the corner from her, and Harriet Tubman. So as every American does, I knew a little bit about Tubman's exploits, but it really wasn't much. And I didn't know anything about the other two. But I was really curious about how these three women came together and how Harriet Tubman ended up in Auburn, New York. It just seemed peculiar. And as I began to look into their lives, I found out that Frances, who was shy and pretty sickly most of the time, a politician's wife, Martha, a middle-class mother of six, and Harriet, a freedom seeker from Maryland, had worked to help overturn a political system that, contrary to many high-minded claims, was grossly undemocratic. And that's what inspired me to write this book. Even Frances's husband, the most prominent anti-slavery politician of the 1850s, he was notoriously so, of course, in the South, even he advised her not to sign a petition demanding the abolition of slavery while she was in Washington with him. She responded, "I cannot be idle." She knew I found out about the local branch of the Underground Railroad from two of her father's servants who had become her servants. And they were active on the local branch. And she soon became one of its invaluable agents too, sheltering fugitive slaves, giving them money when they came to her door. And for those who wanted to stay in Auburn, which was a more or less integrated city, she helped them find contacts who would help them get settled. Martha began to organize and speak at anti-slavery conventions in Buffalo, Syracuse, Auburn, and Albany, especially as the 1850s went on. Mobs invariably gathered at the meeting halls, heckling the participants and sometimes physically threatening them. Her husband was really worried about her safety. This was not an easy thing to do. And in Albany, violence was predicted. And so Martha, who had organized that convention, asked the mayor to sit on the stage with them, and he held a loaded pistol in his lap. Harriet, meanwhile, liberated herself from slavery, walking alone almost 100 miles from the plantation on the Eastern Shore where she had grown up, all the way to Philadelphia, which she had heard about as a free city. She got a job and an apartment, and dedicated the rest of her long life to helping Black Americans achieve freedom. The audacity of these three women just astounded me. They believed, they were so close still, just a generation or two from the Declaration of Independence and the founding of this country, and they believed literally in what the Declaration of Independence said about equality. And although they didn't, as women, they didn't have any evident power to change anything, but they played key roles in what became the Second American Revolution for full civil rights for all Americans. Their achievements, and those of the agitators whom they worked with, and it was a very, very small, reviled group, they all served as a model for future organizers in this country. As I discovered, one of Tubman's friends, Mary Tolbert, was a founder of the NAACP, the League, and the League of Women Voters arose out of the insistent demands for women's suffrage, again, directly from the work they did throughout their lives, and then work that their children ended up doing, and in some cases their grandchildren. And you've heard about many of the young grassroots groups that have been growing in recent years: Me Too, Black Lives Matter, Rock the Vote, and since Trump's infamous slur about Hillary Clinton, the nasty woman movement, and they've done some good things, in my opinion. In 2010, during that visit to the Seward House Museum, the tour guide, Jennifer Haynes, so in that first visit, I noticed that the whole structure was a shrine to William H. Seward, sort of not surprisingly, but my tour guide, Jennifer Haynes, pointed out that the house had actually been built by Frances's father, and she came to own it. She lived there for her whole life, and then she came to own it after her father died. So let's take a look at Frances. Here we go. As a young woman, young wife and mother, Jennifer led me down a steep back staircase and showed me the original kitchen where Frances hid fugitive slaves. And it pretty much looks like that today. As she talked, I just found myself completely riveted by the idea of this woman who was basically lost to history, and I wanted to know more. Back upstairs, the museum director, at my request, the first thing he thought of was to open a thick binder, and he showed me a copy of a desperate letter Frances had written to her husband in 1831, April, when she was 26. It described how her adored sister, Lizette, was being beaten by her husband, a man named Alva Worden. Lizette wept as Worden grabbed their daughter, who screamed for her mother. He snatched away a book Frances was reading, threw it across the room, swore at her, and told her to go home. Frances wrote to Seward, "My own dear Henry," calling him by his middle name, "Worden has turned me out of the house and abused me in every possible way." Lizette had told Frances that she would do anything to get away from him if she could take her child with her. But she was completely trapped. According to law, when women got married, they became their husband's property. If they had an inheritance, as Lizette did, he controlled it. They couldn't sit on juries, make a will, sign a contract, or file a lawsuit. And of course, they couldn't vote. If a woman pursued divorce, she became a pariah in the community. She lost everything: her children, any financial support, and her reputation. And most women, not surprisingly, who were caught in abusive marriages were too cowed or ashamed to speak about it. Frances was appalled by Lizette's helplessness. She thought she should have the right to divorce and to retain custody of their children. All women should. That was a really radical notion in those days. It's hard for us to fathom just how out there she was in that belief. She wrote to Henry, "Men have framed laws, I believe, to uphold themselves in their wickedness." She couldn't help her sister, so she had to ask Henry to intervene. A few years later, in the summer of 1835, Frances witnessed the full horrors of slavery for the first time. During a trip into the South, she wrote in her journal one day about one day in Virginia when they stopped at a tavern north of Richmond. They heard the sounds of weeping and saw 10 naked little boys tied together by their wrists. They watched with horror as a tall white man, holding a whip, led them to a horse trough to drink and then to a shed where they sobbed themselves to sleep. The slave trader was taking them to Richmond, where they would be sold at an auction, just a few of the tens of thousands of enslaved people Virginia supplied to the cotton and rice fields of the Deep South. So that's what an auction looked like. Frances wrote, "Slavery, slavery, the evil effects constantly coming before me and marring everything." By the time she returned to Auburn, she was a committed abolitionist. I thought these two revelations exposed the clearest injustices in American democracy, yet no one had ever written in depth about Frances, or much of anything, really, about her work with Martha and Harriet Tubman. William Seward's first biographer, Glendon Van Dusen, a very highly regarded biographer, who published his book in 1965, dismissed her as a neurotic invalid, and that alone really got me going. Her doctors at the time didn't know anything about migraine, headaches, and clinical depression. They were so-called female problems that were vaguely diagnosed as she was vaguely diagnosed as a neurasthenic, which didn't mean anything. When I went to look at the Seward papers at the University of Rochester, I found them almost untouched all those years later. And a curator told me that when they were donated in the 1950s, that was around when Van Dusen was doing his research for his book, they were set aside as worthless. But as I'd found out, letters can be extraordinarily revealing. And Frances's, I just sat down, the curator brought out boxes and boxes of these things, and I started reading them, and they were acerbic and keenly discerning, often furious. And they also turned out, when pulled all together, and I read thousands of them, to be a hidden history of the tumultuous years before and during the Civil War. With unforgettable, and these are observations that a male historian would not have thought to make. That nobody looked at these letters, and this was through the eyes of a woman, and women's views were supposedly not of interest. And she had these unforgettable portrayals of Lincoln, Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and best of all, I thought of her. She had only one friend who she made when she went to Washington, and that was the abolitionist senator Charles Sumner, who was considered a sort of a pompous ass by his colleagues, even those who agreed with him, but she loved him because of his political beliefs. And they too turned out to have a correspondence, which I found at Harvard, and her letters to him and some of his to her are equally revealing. She and Henry, oddly, lived apart for most of their marriage. During his 2 terms as senator and then his 8 years as Lincoln's Secretary of State, Frances insisted on staying in Auburn. Still, they wrote to each other several times a week, so thus providing, one of the bases of this book. As I began to read these letters, she just felt eerily alive to me 2 centuries later. And again, a lot of the concerns she was bringing up, this country is still grappling with. Unusually well educated for a woman of the time, she read everything from Thucydides to abolitionist leaflets. The notorious Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 allowed slave catchers to travel to free states to hunt down what were called runaways, and required citizens and police to deliver any suspects to federal commissioners. From her father's home, that's the Seward House as it looked back then, or the Miller House as it was called at the time, she began to deliver regular reports to Henry about how people across the state were rebelling against the act, organizing rescues, among other things, of captured freedom seekers and escorting them to Canada. Henry, of course, opposed slavery and the new law, very, very strongly so, but he was an exceedingly shrewd politician, and although he quietly supported the rescues, he did not advocate immediate abolition, because that was impolitic in southern Washington. So she clipped and saved key lectures by abolitionists, and for more than a decade, she urged him to listen to what they were saying. This was an ongoing argument between the two of them, and it got more and more heated as the decade went on. Frances saw Washington as a repellent backwater. There were no public schools, there was no police force, and pigs rooted through garbage in the alleys. The Capitol was under renovation. Hold on. As you can see, the dome wasn't put on. The hill was strewn with marble columns, lumber, and workmen's sheds. Southern politicians were a majority in Congress, and the city was the site of the biggest slave trade in the country. Men, women, and children were routinely led in chains down the mall to jails where they were held before they were sold. So that's one slave house on the mall. There were few museums at the time. I think only maybe the Smithsonian was complete, and maybe not even. Let's see, there. That's one of the jails. Henry was more lenient than most husbands. He respected Frances's beliefs. They argued sometimes genially, and sometimes not. But he had one demand about their unusual living arrangement. During Washington's busy social season each winter, Frances must come down and serve as his hostess. He loved hosting big parties and entertaining Northern and Southern colleagues at lavish parties several times a week. And these were dozens and dozens of people with multi-course dinners. These were a big, complicated thing to arrange. She hated that. She was an introvert, had no interest in small talk. Or the ornate silks and hats that these women were dressed in. So she still had to dress formally in the morning for visiting and receiving guests, and even more so each evening. Like that, with a braided bun, with corsets reinforced with light steel and enormous hoop skirts, and then exchange pleasantries for hours with Henry's guests. She wrote to Lizette during her first Washington winter, "It is the life to which I am doomed." No wonder she had migraines and depression. It doesn't take a psychiatrist to figure that one out. It took her 9 years to get up the courage to tell him she wouldn't do it anymore. And again, that just shows the power dynamic between husbands and wives. Western New York, up here, was a world away from Washington, though it was not necessarily a liberal bastion, to say the least. It was heavily populated by conservative bankers, industrialists, and farmers, and pockets of radical men and women. So these outliers, were a legacy of the Second Great Awakening. In the 1920s, evangelical preachers had begun traversing the state, holding camp meetings where they declared slavery to be a sin and women to have agency over their own lives. Women came back from these meetings, and their husbands were not exactly pleased. But enough people became revivalists that this region, as probably many of you know, was known as the burned over district, referring to the fervor of the converted. Frances, it must be said, was a bit of a snob and found the meetings embarrassing. But the movement left behind a patchy network of reformers all the way across this middle band of New York State who totally shared her views. Syracuse, in particular, was known as a hotbed of insurrectionists, and in 1851, they coordinated what came to be called the Jerry Rescue, and it was celebrated among many Syracusans for every year afterward. They whisked away a fugitive slave from Missouri who had been captured after living and working there for years. And they were helped, interestingly, by a pro-slavery butcher who objected to the federal government imposing its laws on his city. He did not like these men being allowed to come into Syracuse and arrest someone. So the butcher, hid Jerry for 4 days, then armed him, threw a tarp over him, and drove him out of town in his meat wagon. So you can begin to see that this movement is beginning, and it's beginning to spread outside the bounds of, the tiny bands of abolitionists and women's rights reformers. Still, in Auburn, Martha had only one close friend, and that's Martha Coffin Wright. She looks pretty demure, doesn't she? But if you look at her eyes, you can see a glint of trouble there. She's very young there. Her husband, David, was a local lawyer. She often said how much she envied his stimulating work and his freedom to travel. By the mid-1840s, she had 6 small children and could barely get out the door. Unlike Frances, who had a house full of servants to clean, cook, and help care for her children, Martha oversaw a tight budget and did all the housework herself. Her chief correspondent was her older sister, the notorious Quaker minister and human rights activist Lucretia Mott. Lucretia lived in Philadelphia, where she was a leader in the abolitionist movement, openly socializing with other radicals, white and black. Martha's life, as she saw it, was a sorry contrast to her sister's. She wrote wearily, and again, she was much younger than Lucretia. Lucretia's children were all grown at that point. The only ways to grub and work and sweep and dust and wash and dress children and make gingerbread and patch and darn. Just bathing 3 of the youngest children took her 3 hours. And by the way, I should say that, as you know, many of you, Martha Coffin Wright lived in Aurora with David in the early years of their marriage. She hated it, especially when he was traveling, because it was so rural, and she loved the hubbub of Philadelphia and the social life that her sister had. And so at her urging, they ended up moving to Auburn. So once they had moved, when Martha could slip out, she stopped by Frances's house to borrow and discuss incendiary books and pamphlets from her library. Frances really admired Lucretia Mott, who traveled around the country giving fiery talks. So she was a Quaker, and she simply defied the social prohibition against women speaking in public. She didn't care. In fact, she thought it was her duty to do so. In 1843, Martha began using her kitchen as a stop on the Underground Railroad. After Frances's father died, so did she. They were breaking the law and, ostensibly risking heavy fines and possible imprisonment, but they were finally enacting one of their core beliefs, and that was incredibly important to them. Seward gave Frances more leeway in Auburn than he did in Washington, again, this deeply southern city, and encouraged her covert activities up here. On one rare occasion when she was away and he was there, he wrote to her, "The Underground Railroad works wonderfully. 2 passengers came here last night." Martha was constantly enraged. She was furious that women in the North were subjected to what was essentially a form of house arrest. And she had grown up in a Quaker household. Her father had died young. Her mother brought up all the children. It was just taken for granted in that household that women were men's equals. So she just couldn't stand this. And she did practice Quakerism at home, instilling her beliefs in her children as she saw fit. She didn't take them to church, obviously, and so her neighbors branded her an infidel. When young men studying at the august Auburn Theological Seminary, which is now Union Seminary in New York, when they came to the door to proselytize, warning her about the fate of children who didn't devote Sundays to God, she replied she didn't believe in forcing her children to read the Bible. Through Lucretia, she'd gotten to know the abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, who ran the American Anti-Slavery Society, and she kept a stack of its pamphlets near the front door, telling the seminarians that she would only read their tracts if they would read hers. She wrote to Lucretia, "These ascetics give religion such a repulsive character. I wonder who was ever made better by the perusal of such nonsense." So she was, as you can see, a very entertaining and revelatory letter writer as well. I really like writing nonfiction through the eyes of seemingly ordinary people because it reveals really precisely and intimately the kinds of experiences that spark action. Her husband, David, was an abolitionist, but he emphatically opposed women's rights. He just thought that was a terrible idea. Martha, though, made all of the family clothes, and when they finally had enough money to hire a seamstress, she told David that it was unfair to pay Miss Soule half of what they paid the man who worked and helped him with his outdoor chores. She said women too should be able to save up for old age when they couldn't work anymore. David replied that equal wages would be a curse to the community. And Martha wrote to Lucretia that he refused to argue anymore. He went off in a huff to hoe his corn or cut asparagus. And so she expressed her anger in these sharply acid letters. But you think about it, she was almost 125 years ahead of her time. It wasn't until 1963 that Congress got around to passing the Equal Pay Act. And most women still don't make what men do. Finally, in July 1848, Martha revolted in public. She was 41 and pregnant with her 7th baby, one she didn't want. At a social gathering in Waterloo, Martha, Lucretia, and 3 other women, Jane Hunt, Marianne McClintock, and young Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a real firebrand, agreed that it was time to change the laws and that a small group of white men had created to keep women in their place, and they organized the Seneca Falls Convention. It was the first public gathering in this country devoted entirely to women's rights. Scholars, of course, have written a great deal about it, but I wanted to tell it from Martha's point of view. Over the 2-day convention, she befriended 2 people who changed her life. And in these days, 41, she thought of herself as an old woman. She was not, however. And so the 2 people were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and the world-famous abolitionist Frederick Douglass. Stanton became the driving force at Seneca Falls, not Lucretia, even though she was the respected elder. And Stanton insisted that the right to vote should be among the women's demands. Lucretia had been an activist for decades, and she knew what and what was not, possible, conceivable in coming decades, and thought that women would only hurt their cause by pressing for a goal that was just considered laughable. She told Stanton, "Lizzie, thou wilt make the convention ridiculous." She had her way, though. Stanton did. The organizers invited Douglass, who had just started his newspaper, the North Star, in Rochester, and Martha made sure to get to know him there. He wrote just admirably, she thought, in his report of Seneca Falls, and this is something probably no other man would have had the courage to write. He wrote, "There can be no reason in the world for denying women the exercise of the elective franchise." So Martha ended up agreeing with Stanton and Douglass, not with her sister. Stanton saw Martha's potential as an organizer and immediately enlisted her in the incipient women's rights movement. Douglass drew her further into abolition. He regularly gave talks across New York State, and after one visit to her home, she invited him to stop by whenever he was there. A woman at a party sneeringly asked Martha whether she'd given him and the other guests their best room. Racism, and again, it was rampant. That was the common view. The local hotel wouldn't house African Americans. At another party, Martha overheard a guest stage whisper, "Who is that fine-looking lady?" The other replied, "That is Mrs. David Wright. She is a very dangerous woman." And that brings us to Harriet Tubman, the most dangerous of the 3. I love this photograph. It was discovered maybe 5 or 6 years ago in a photo album of Emily Howland, who lived not far away, and was a very close friend of Frances, Harriet, and Martha. So the old girl network, you can see it at work in these towns. They quickly got to know who like-minded people were. And then as Harriet entered Auburn, she was introduced to some of these people. So this photograph is now in the collection of the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the Washington Mall. Through Tubman, I wanted to show how the Underground Railroad worked and to portray her really as a flesh and blood woman, not the one-dimensional hero of our 8th grade textbooks. By the time she met Frances and Martha early in the 1850s, they were insurgents, ready to help the cause of women's rights and abolition any way they could. In 1849, at age 27, when Harriet learned that she was about to be sold to a slaveholder in the Deep South, she had escaped, leaving behind her free husband, John Tubman, and her parents and siblings. John and two of Harriet's brothers refused to join her on a journey they believed would end in capture and severe punishment, if not death. Harriet went on her own, and in Philadelphia, she was assisted immediately by the city's Vigilance Committee, founded by Lucretia Mott's African-American colleague, Robert Purvis. The committee, and there were committees like this in cities across New York State, provided fugitives with food, shelter, clothing, money, and medical and legal help. Purvis commented teasingly that Lucretia was the most belligerent pacifist he ever saw. She said of that description, "I glory in it." As Harriet began to plot a series of incursions into the Eastern Shore to free her family and friends, she met Lucretia. The Underground Railroad, of course, depended on absolutely trustworthy associates in slave and free states. Harriet intended to rescue her entire family and as many other enslaved people as she could. But few who had escaped slavery regularly went back, and longtime abolitionists in Philadelphia warned her it would be impossible. She refused to listen, telling them that it was what God intended her to do and that he would protect her. She set out also to expand her network of contacts in the North, so Martha and Frances became absolutely invaluable. There's no record of how she met the Auburn women, but it's pretty clear that Lucretia introduced Martha to her during one of Martha's annual family visits to Philadelphia, and then Martha introduced Harriet to Frances in Auburn. And Martha's and Frances's basement kitchens became regular stops for Harriet on her Underground Railroad trips, and the women motivated and depended on each other. Frances and Martha were transfixed by the story of Harriet's life. She had made that solitary walk to Philadelphia, expecting that when she returned to Maryland, John would accompany her back north. Instead, she discovered when she went back for him, he had married another woman. She was devastated. That was 2 years after she had left, and she had saved up all this money. She had their life planned. And she told a friend in Boston that she wanted to go right in and make all the trouble she could, but then realized how foolish it was just for temper to make mischief. She was hard-headed, even in that moment, and she said she simply dropped him out of her heart. And that was the beginning of her career as a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She couldn't read or write, so I didn't have the resources I did in the letters of the other two. But she was a brilliant strategist in everything she did, and I concluded that she had purposefully left behind an oral history. I pieced it together from contemporaneous accounts of what she told others, and from the scholarship of recent decades, of which there's a lot and very good material. She told the same stories repeatedly, both privately and as the 1850s went on, and she got to know the wealthy abolitionists in Boston in public as a way of raising money for her journeys back to Maryland. She was tiny, only 5 feet tall, and she wore a homespun dress and kerchief and entranced white listeners. There are a number of accounts of watching her speak. She acted out her life and told very funny anecdotes about how she outwitted former masters. And one friend in Boston wrote that she played all the parts, and the scene rises before you as she saw it, and her voice and language change with her different actors. Harriet couldn't remember her oldest sister, who was sold when she was 3 years old. 2 other sisters had been leased away by their enslaver as their mother pleaded for mercy. Imagine how this story struck Martha and Frances with their very close relationships to their sisters and their, quite privileged lives. She had scars on her neck from whippings by a sadistic woman who put her to work when she was a little girl and thrashed her for failing to do her chores properly. She had periodic blackouts from a head injury she'd suffered when an overseer hurled an iron weight at an enslaved man at a dry goods store, and it hit Harriet instead. The trouble in her head, as she called it, gave rise to visions that she considered prophetic, and she had somehow memorized long passages of the Bible. In the spring of 1859, almost a decade after Harriet had gotten to know the other two, Frances decided she needed to do more to undermine slavery. Martha was organizing conventions for women's rights and for abolition, braving the mobs. Harriet was repeatedly risking her lives, rescuing even her elderly parents and taking them all the way to St. Catharines, Canada, where she lived with them when she wasn't on one of her expeditions. Harriet's parents, Frances knew from her, were unwell and unhappy so far away and almost entirely dependent on Harriet. Frances suggested that Auburn would be a far more convenient location for all of them. When Frances's father had died, he'd left her quite a bit of land, and in 1848, the state legislature had given women the rights to their own inheritances. One of the parcels, which many of you have seen, about a mile down South Street from the Seward House, included 7 acres, a new frame house, a barn, and a few outbuildings. Frances decided that Harriet should have it. And again, it's hard to emphasize just how subversive this is. Women didn't sell property, or very rarely, let alone of fugitive slaves. And Frances would be flouting the Fugitive Slave Act just as Henry was beginning a very long, carefully plotted run for the presidency in 1860. But at the same time, the two of them had been integrating Auburn for years by selling plots of land and houses to black families in town. If black citizens came to own a certain number of acres, they were allowed, black men, they were allowed to vote. So this was one of the Seward's ways of integrating the town and helping them become full citizens. Frances clearly saw the sale to Harriet as a natural extension of this undertaking. The Seward's youngest son, Will, who was starting a banking career in Auburn, helped Frances draw up the paperwork for the mortgage. Conveniently for Henry, the sale was completed in the spring of 1859 when he was on an 8-month tour of Europe, Palestine, and Egypt. Interestingly, candidates for the president did not campaign on their own in that era. They had surrogates do it for them. Meanwhile, Martha took in Harriet and 6 men, women, and children on what turned out to be her final Underground Railroad journey. They were followed closely much of the way, and that trip took more than a month. Martha wrote to her spoiled youngest daughter, Ellen, who was at a finishing school in Lenox, Massachusetts, that one woman had held her baby in her arms the entire way. Oh no, it can't fail me now. Hold on, there we go. That's Martha's letter. While Harriet and the men helped along the other children, Martha wrote, "They walked all night carrying the little ones and spread the old comfort on the frozen ground in a thicket where they all hid, while Harriet went out foraging and sometimes could not get back till dark, fearing she would be followed." So again, this is the kind of thing you can get from a letter that you can't get, any other way. Frances's relationship with Harriet made her even more intolerant of the inevitable unsavory trade-offs in politics. So here she is in Auburn at her house in the back garden. Seward lost the 1860 nomination to Lincoln and served instead as his top cabinet official. When he gave his final speech in the Senate, there he is as a mighty statesman, 7 states had already seceded. The goal of the Lincoln administration was not emancipation, but the restoration of the Union. And of course, that's what he very much supported that belief. So he explained in his speech, "In political affairs, we cannot always do what seems to us absolutely best." That prompted a scorching letter from Frances, who accused him of abandoning convictions he'd held his entire life. Compromise is based on the idea that the preservation of the Union is more important than the liberty of nearly 4 million human beings cannot be right. Tens of thousands of books have been written about the Civil War, so I was a little overwhelmed at the thought of this section of the book, but my protagonists had their own harrowing experiences to tell, and again, it was all it was all written up in various different places, and many of them in these letters. Martha's son, Willie, fought heroically at Gettysburg, almost losing his life at Little Round Top. And I've got all of the correspondence. I mean, I was able to pull together enough material for an entire chapter on that. And Francis's son, Will, boy, those whiskers, was wounded at the Battle of Monocacy in Maryland. That was another pivotal engagement in which thwarted the Confederates' planned invasion of Washington. It was a very close call, and they stopped it. Harriet, you won't be surprised to hear, joined the war, telling Martha before she left that she intended to assist the Union Army in Union-occupied South Carolina by doing a kind of secret service. So there she is. Harriet cited the book of Exodus to one friend to explain her decision to go. And again, she believed that God spoke to her. There are many accounts of this. And she said, "The good Lord has come down to deliver my people, and I must go help him." She must have said the same thing to Francis, who wrote to Henry in remarkably similar words just before Harriet departed. "I think we may safely assume that the cry of the oppressed has reached the ear of God and that he has come down to deliver them." So she was an Episcopalian, but very much had the same beliefs that Harriet did. Harriet entrusted her beloved 10-year-old niece, Margaret Stewart, to Francis for the 3 years she served in the war, and Francis essentially brought up Margaret the way she did her own daughter, Fanny. And Harriet did work for the Army as a spy master, getting money from local commanders to pay 8 local scouts to report to her, then delivering intelligence about the movements of enemy troops, which surrounded them on 3 sides. Most remarkably, she accompanied Colonel James Montgomery, a famous abolitionist, and one of the country's first regiments of black soldiers on the lead gunboat in a spectacular offensive called the Combahee River Raid, which was written up in Harper's, among other places. So I wanted to understand the local geography and the difficulty of this offensive. So I went down to Beaufort, which is where Harriet lived and was based, and I met Jeff Grigg, a local author who owns a boatyard there and wrote a book about the raid, and he agreed to show me around. It was really revelatory. And again, when you're doing research, you don't want to just Google everything. You want to go to libraries, and you want to go to the places where people were living and working and doing amazing things. So that was a really worthwhile trip. And he showed me where they burned down the plantations. I think there were 3 or 4 plantations they burned. They flooded the rice fields and returned with 750 freed slaves. Harriet Tubman escorted a number of these men to the local recruiting office, and they became soldiers. After the war, Harriet went back to live in her house in Auburn, a mile or 2 down the road from the Stewarts and Wrights. A few years later, she told her first biographer, Sarah Bradford, who lived in nearby Geneva and had a brother in Auburn. She told her about the sight from the gunboats on one landing. Bradford carefully took down her account, which shows Tubman's inimitable sense of humor and her ease at capturing a scene. This woman had so many talents. So I just have to read this to you. She told Bradford, these are Harriet's words, "Here you'd see a woman with a pail on her head, rice a-smoking in it just as she'd taken it from the fire, young one hanging on behind, one hand around her forehead to hold on, the other digging into the rice pot, eating with all its might. Hold of her dress, 2 or 3 more, down her back, a bag with a pig in it. One woman brought 2 pigs, a white one and a black one. We took them all on board, named the white pig Beauregard, after the Confederate general, and the black pig Jeff Davis, the president of the Confederacy." Harriet called the people fleeing the children of Israel coming out of Egypt. After I finished the book, I went to Fort Hill Cemetery, and I hope those of you who haven't been will make a visit. It's just a lovely park, among other things. It's 83 acres, up and down, tall hills. It's just beautiful. And these 3 women are all buried there. So are many of my relatives. Stopping first at Francis's and Martha's graves, I thought about how they were all but forgotten after they died. Harriet Tubman, a force of nature, lived on for decades, far enough into the 20th century that her life overlapped briefly with my grandmother's. I found her modest gravestone under a towering spruce tree, which was just a little sapling when she was buried. There's a photograph of it. When I was there, visitors had left some offerings on the stone: tiny pine cones, a handful of smooth pebbles, 2 bunches of wild daisies, and 3 pennies showing Lincoln's gaunt profile. Last year, I returned to Auburn for a book talk, and on my way out of town, I stopped again at Harriet's grave with a bunch of flowers this time. And here's the photo I took that Sunday morning. And to end, this is my favorite photo of Harriet Tubman. Thank you very much, and I hope there will be questions.
I think the mics are working. Excellent. So I have a student here, Helen, who is going to bring a microphone around. If you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll bring you a microphone. Anybody? How about I get us started then? So Dorothy, I would be curious to know, what is the most surprising thing you learned while you were doing your research for this book?
I'm sorry, what is what?
The most surprising thing you learned while you were doing your research.
This is a tough one. Let me think, because it was just one surprise after another. I think, and it's hard for me to recall how little I knew when I began, and it was really not very much at all. I think the most surprising thing was the chapter in Beaufort, and seeing that Harriet Tubman, in just 10 years, not only had escaped from slavery, rescued all of these people on the Underground Railroad, but then entered another chapter of her life, and she was effectively a soldier, and the woman is just, you can see how much I admire her. And then she lived such a long life. So after the Civil War, she kept going, and she got to know everybody in Auburn, and she raised money at Christmas fairs to sent the proceeds down to some of the people. She had helped the freed people of Port Royal, which is where she was, and when she worked there, she also worked in a soup kitchen, and she worked as a nurse. It just was an unending story of these chapters where she kept reinventing herself, but it was always in the mission to help other people who needed help more than she thought she ever had.
Thank you. Does anybody else have a question they would like to ask? Don't be shy.
Yeah. Not a single one?
Nobody. Oh, we've got a question right there. All right, where you have a microphone heading your way.
Hi.
Hi.
So what is your next book going to be about?
Oh, I hate it when people ask me that. So it's been a while since I wrote this book too. I mean, I wrote it was published during COVID. So I spent a long time trying to figure out, and I'm still trying to figure out actually, whether I want to write another book of historical nonfiction. I'm still quite interested in Colorado and the West. So there are a couple of little threads, and I'm going out every other year. They do a fundraiser out in tiny little Hayden, which is where my grandmother got off the train before she went up that mountain, and Roz went up that mountain. And now they do a fundraiser every other year because the schoolhouse is still there. So I go out and talk a little bit about that book. So I may just do a little bit more research when I'm out there. I'm now just writing for the New Yorker, and so right now I'm in this century, and because things are so extremely unsettled, I sort of feel driven to write about this period. And so I've got one idea I'd like to pursue, which I'm not at liberty to disclose yet, but it's about a modern day agitator who's done and who's known around the world. So I will say no more. But the book, this book took 8 years to write because I was working full time as well. And books are, very, very taxing. It was like a triple biography. So I'm going to think I don't regret I love doing it. I loved writing this book, but you have to think very long and hard before you take on a big project, because it's all consuming, as my children would tell you.
Dorothy, you talked about the letters that you found at Francis's letters. That were there other source material that was really surprising to you?
So there were Martha's letters, but a scholarly book had been written by one of Martha's descendants, had been written about that drew from those, and those are at Smith College. They're part of the William Lloyd Garrison collection, because one of Martha's daughters married one of William Lloyd Garrison's sons. It was very incestuous, that little group. So I looked at letters throughout, and then I mentioned the letters to and from Charles Sumner, which were quite wonderful to Francis. And so I got off on this, you tend to go down rabbit holes, because I wanted to learn all about Charles Sumner, who was a fascinating, complicated, difficult person, and ended up really dismaying Francis a lot. She was very, very close to him, and he later betrayed. He was friends with Henry, with Seward, and he later betrayed him, and she sort of didn't forgive him for a decade, and then it took a long time before she came around. So there were a lot of letters, and then, as I say, that I went back and read earlier biographies and things, and a lot of the work of doing something like this is putting things together in a way that nobody's ever put them together before. So, for instance, all the earlier accounts of the sale of the property to Harriet Tubman on South Street had said that William Seward had sold the house, and I just knew from all the work I had done that no, he wasn't even in the country at the time, and he wouldn't have done that. It was Frances's inheritance. She had the money at that point; it was hers, and it was her friend, and so that was something she did. And again, this shows you how history gets distorted when it's told only through one male prism. And so this is, and I was talking earlier with someone about how many stories are still out there, and they tend to be about these ordinary people that people want to always write about the famous men. And the truth is, there are a lot of really good stories out there. And so I'm always, if anyone has any good ideas for a good book, I'm always looking for more of them. But this one turned out to be just a total gold mine.
You said something in the book about if Francis had lived, and how Henry might have taken a slightly different tack, because under Andrew Johnson, he didn't seem to be too focused on the needs of Reconstruction, and he was he was pretty happy to, apparently pretty happy to be doing Andrew Johnson's bidding, which was, of course, not very helpful.
That was a huge disappointment to me. This is the other thing, you find out things about people that other historians know this, and this was what Francis kept warning him about endlessly: don't compromise your principles, because if you keep doing it, you're going to go too far. And you're going to end up doing things that you don't even believe in. And so Andrew Johnson was a terrible president. I mean, he reminds me of a certain other ex-president. Just a very bad guy. And he was the terms for bringing former members of Congress from the South back in were ridiculously lenient. They were traitors. I mean, again, this is my opinion, but. And Francis had died, as many of you know if you read the book. Francis died quite young, at age 57, and that was around the time that Lincoln died, and so she didn't see any of that. If she had lived, I think she simply wouldn't. She would have say, "It's time for you to retire." He should have retired. He just couldn't. He was addicted to politics. He just couldn't do it. He loved the power. And, you know, why should he step down? He was one of the most famous men in the world. And he decided, well, let's bring the country together again, let's make peace. And he didn't quite anticipate how awful Johnson was going to be and what it was going to mean for the future, near future of the country, continued future of the country.
So I still have the microphone, so follow-up question. So did you discover that Frances had tried to provide a similar kind of influence to her sons who didn't, I mean, you know, it seems to me there should have been somebody, she was no longer around. Where were they? You know, what were they doing?
Well, you know, that is a good question. I ended up not researching that part of it very deeply. I met with a descendant of Frances, of the Sewards, who lived along the lake near Auburn. And he said, you know, the men of the subsequent generations weren't all that impressive. It's a little unfair because Will Seward, I can't remember what he came back to do, but he fought in the war. He was a very honorable young man. But he sort of said, well, it was, you know, the women in the family that I'm most proud of. So Augustus, Gus, was, as you probably picked up, was a deeply depressed young man, very, very unhappy. The family suspects he was homosexual, but, you know, repressed. And I think he never did much of anything. And so he was ended up being kind of a sad character, definitely inherited his mother's depression.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. We have a YouTube comment. Very exciting.
Oh, wow.
All right. So I'm just going to read, there's actually two. So it says, hello from Buffalo, New York. I'm a huge fan. I have a question, if it is possible to ask. Were there any other abolitionists from the Western New York era that need more research, that we need to do more research on? And in addition to abolitionists, are there any interesting ordinary people from that era that are deserving of research?
Well, that's really an excellent question that no one else has ever asked, and it would be from a person from Western New York. So, as I said, this region was just full of, you know, all of these reformers of all kinds, and there was something called the Western, I think it was called the Western New York Abolitionist Society, and that was, so Frederick Douglass joined that, and there were members of that, and there were people like Jane Hunt who helped organize the Seneca Falls Convention. Of course, we know about Susan B. Anthony, thank you. So Susan B. Anthony met Martha and Elizabeth Cady Stanton a couple years after Seneca Falls, and then of course she became a working partner with Martha, with Stanton, and then Martha was kind of their third in command. So there were I would have to go back and look at the book again. Often in cases like this, it's good to look at the endnotes and to people who are just mentioned in passing. I'm trying to think if there's anybody offhand in Buffalo. I can't think of any. Certainly in Rochester. I mean, there were so many. And a lot of these people were just shopkeepers. And so during the Jerry rescue, which I mentioned, there was a hardware store owner, and the members of this fugitive slave society had sent out a warning that they needed to gather and help this man. And they rang all the church bells in town, and that was a signal for everybody to get together at one appointed spot and rescue him. So this hardware store owner put out axes and clubs and things outside, and then people would go out and pick up the clubs and everything, and they had to break open the doors of the building where Jerry was held and everything. I mean, this was pretty intense.
There's a great statue in Syracuse commemorating it.
A great place to look is often local historical museums. They are full, and libraries.
Yeah, go check out your local archives.
They're just full of untold stories that need to be told before they just completely disappear.
All right, well, thank you. So there is going to be a signing following this out in the lobby. If you brought your own book, great. We do have a limited number of books available. They are free of charge. So if you would like to get your copy signed, please line up out in the lobby. We will be out there shortly. But otherwise, thank you so much to Dorothy Wickenden. And thank you all for coming. Have a safe drive home.
Yes, thank you so much.